So welcome to the second of 3 lectures presented by the George Washington Foundation and tonight the National Park Service. This is the second talk of the George Washington Foundation lecture series. Our speaker is Deb Lawton, who is a National Park Service Ranger at the George Washington Birthplace. She completed her master's degree in history in 2014 and has spent the last 25 years studying culinary history. She is married with 6 children and a husband she occasionally cooks for.
So thank you, Dave. This guy up here was the funniest illustration I could find for foodways in the 18th century. Food has always been more than just a way to fill our stomachs. If any of you were here last week when Mara was talking, she was talking about how the ceramics and the stuff you put in the cups and the glasses all reflected who you were and what you were in society. Well, it's the same thing with the food. It is a physical substance that supplies our needs. We love to eat it. It can also show our culture, our social standing or lack thereof. It can make a statement. It can show our social class, either what we are or what we want to be. Serving, consuming, or even abstaining from food can be a bit of a performance art and really gets wrapped up into foodways, as does food transportation, as does how you cook the food, as does how you preserve the food, and how you grow it as well. Don't worry, we're not going to talk about all of that tonight, just some. In order to discuss the 18th century foodways, though, we really have to start with an understanding of what the culture was like. In the 18th century, in England, and therefore here in the colonies, it was a very class-based society. Of course, at the top, you had the royalty. Then next, you had the very rich gentry. Below that, the middling gentry. You also had freemen, indentured servants, and the enslaved. And all of those kind of ate differently. How you lived, how you dressed, how you married, how you buried, how you ate was all dependent on your class. The trickle-down effects on cuisine usually started up at the royalty, and it slowly got down to the lower classes. But the influence was not always a one-way street. Even the foodways with the enslaved worked their way up into the foodways of the gentry over time. It's easiest to learn about the foodways from the courtly or the upper gentry classes. The reason for this is this was the most literate group. So they were the ones who were writing. They were the ones who were writing journals, diaries, letters. They were the ones who were purchasing cookbooks. This is one piece of a cookbook from the time period. This is actually a Hannah Glasse cookbook from 1767. And this was the first cookbook that got me interested in culinary history. Now this is a copy of a page from a cookbook held at George Washington Birthplace National Monument. It was ascribed to Sarah Taylor Washington. There are 4 different handwritings in that book, so we're not quite sure whose are whose yet. But this is also a soft gingerbread recipe, the second recipe down. Anybody want to take a crack at reading that? Out loud.
3 pounds of flour, sugar.
So that's one of the challenges with looking at manuscript cookbooks of the time, is trying to read the handwriting. When a person purchased a cookbook, they may have been saying how they wanted their household to be run. We do have also at the Birthplace a copy of the Hannah Glasse cookbook, but it was inscribed by the name of William Augustine. It was from the man who purchased the cookbook. So he may have been telling his wife, this is how I want you to run the household. Now the middling gentry also left us some writing, so we can sort of track a little bit more what they wanted. As the 17th century progressed, printers began printing cookbooks that were aimed at allowing the middle gentry to eat more like their uppers. It required up to about 40 years for a recipe to trickle down from being an invention to actually showing up in a cookbook. I mean, right now we can upload to allrecipes.com while we're cooking. That's not how it happened. And once it got in the cookbooks, it took about 10 years to drop a socioeconomic class. So by the time you've got recipes that were published in the courtly cookbooks, it took about 10 years to go down to the gentry cookbooks. A little bit about cookbooks. They happen to be a favorite of mine, and they are perennially a favorite of printers because they're one of the best-selling categories of printed books. Printing had a huge impact on Foodways and its transmission. Printing provided the opportunities for chefs to put down the details of the foods that they had served successfully and how they had served them, and just as important, to whom they had served them. That information could then be circulated to other chefs. Cooking trends could spread much more efficiently once these books were printed. And notice that the emphasis at that level was on what was served successfully and who it was served to. The cooks themselves were showing off the class of their customers to raise their own class status. The actual recipes contain ingredients at that level, but not amounts. Sometimes in the early cookbooks, the recipes are simply how to dress the dish for presentation. They don't even tell you how to cook it. They don't tell you what went into the dish. When La Varenne, a French cook, published his cookbook in 1651, he tapped into a new way of presenting recipes. His recipes contained ingredients, they contained amounts, they contained cooking procedures, and presentation suggestions. Now, he was the one responsible for what the French called Nouvelle Cuisine, the new way of cooking. His recipes would eventually overtake the way of cooking and eating that was common in the 1600s in France and England, and thus in the colonies as well, eventually. Foodways change incredibly slowly. We as humans, we don't like change, particularly not with something as near and dear to our heart as food. So we admit change really slowly. We might try one new recipe a week. And so it takes a long time for these new foodways to be committed. Most of the time in the cookbooks, you'll find out that there are new recipes mixed in with the old recipes until the old recipes get so out of step with the newer recipes that they're eventually dropped from the cookbooks. Now, La Varenne's recipes result in dishes that are not spice-filled mixtures of many flavors. That was typical of the medieval cooking. The medieval cooking, the emphasis was on the dish, and you tried to create this almost magical mixture of flavors that didn't resemble any of the ingredients. La Varenne instead emphasized the different ingredients. So his spices were meant to bring out the flavor of like the carrots, for example. Now, in the medieval mind, because sugar was expensive, you put sugar in everything, particularly if it had meat. Spices were very heavily used. A good example that we still hold on to today, remember I said cooking changes really slowly? Mincemeat pie with real mince, that was developed in the Middle Ages. But La Varenne's ingredients present almost a modular way of cooking. His methods used carefully constructed sauces without a whole lot of spices. And he used a lot of complex meat and vegetable-based sauces that he called coulisses. These pre-prepared mixtures, along with pre-sauteed mushrooms or pre-cooked chicken, would be kept on hand to dress various dishes and make them look or taste more complex. It's kind of the same way we might keep a box of canned stock in our cupboard, or a can of cooked chicken if all of a sudden we decide the sauce needs more chicken. Now, of course, La Varenne was writing for the very courtly class, the bourgeois, who had sufficient cooking staff to cook all of these pre-prepared modules and then work them into the different dishes. But this was the new cuisine. By the mid-18th century, the older cuisine had become so incompatible with the Nouvelle cuisine, it got dropped out of the books. But phasing out the old ideas, with the exception of things like mincemeat, took almost a century in the cookbooks. The Nouvelle cuisine represented a whole new way of looking at cooking. It changed the idea of cooking to be one of interchangeable modules, and that really fit in with the new Enlightenment idea the new philosophical and scientific ideas that were present at the time. In 1691, a fellow named Massaloit published a cookbook that furthered La Varenne's methods, and he had the novel idea of arranging the cookbook alphabetized by ingredient. Instead of just having to thumb through and figure out where the recipe was, you could look up where it was. That was revolutionary. Massaloit changed some of La Varenne's methods a little bit. He developed not just a vegetable braised sauce called a Glasse, but he also had essences, which are really cooked down, pureed food, usually meat, kind of like the consistency of baby food. And that would be used to thicken the sauces. So why am I talking about French cookbooks in the 1600s when I'm supposed to be talking about the 18th century? Well, it's because that was the basis of what became the 18th century cooking. Massaloit's cookbook got plagiarized eventually. It was plagiarized by La Chapelle. He took about 1/3 to 1/2 of the recipes from Massaloit's book and put in a few English recipes, put in a general declaration of how bad off the French were in their cooking, and published the book. There were no copyright laws, so he didn't suffer any consequences for his plagiarism. Because this book came out as an English imprimatur, it opened up the way in the English gentry life to actually discuss these ideas, to actually start cooking this way, because all of a sudden it was English, it wasn't French anymore. Since the English and the French have never been good siblings, this was important. Some English cookbooks, like those by Patrick Lamb or Robert May, that's actually a picture of Robert May from the front piece of his book. They had given some lip service to the idea of the French cooking. Their recipes are kind of the straddling recipes between when the French cooking first got introduced to England and as the English were trying to keep up their old ways as well. The La Chapelle publication majored in the new style instead of being this transitional style. And the older dishes became seen as passé. You did not want them on your table. The Nouvelle Cuisine style, popularized by La Chapelle, made cooking more accessible to those who did not have access, either by choice or by finances, to the French cooks that had been imported before, or the 14-room kitchens like Versailles boasted. I can't imagine cooking in a 14-room kitchen, but that's how many different rooms they had. The next step in the evolution of this cooking was that some authors began to publish books for cooks, usually women, who cooked for their own household or who cooked for the smaller middle-class establishments. By 1710 to 1730, these new cooking ideas were considered the most current way to cook and eat in England. If you were in the know, this is how you ate. So the opening years of the 18th century were really the years that transitioned this type of cooking from England to France. Now, cooking styles or food items can be fad items that not everyone adopts at the same time. Different areas and different groups can be fast or slow adopters. We're no different today. Anybody remember the Jell-O vegetable salads? Yeah, they were really popular in the 70s and 80s. Jell-O was invented in the 1930s, probably hit the top of its craze in the 1950s. And these phased out mostly by the mid-80s. My brother-in-law discovered Jell-O vegetable salads in the middle 1990s. And these came back to the family Thanksgiving table. So he's a slow adopter. There are other people in history that have been that way. So not everybody in England at the time adopted the it foods at the same pace. From the courtly class down the social scale, these new ideas kind of tumbled. Since it required years for new recipes to show up in cookbooks, the change came pretty slowly to people further down the scale. So how do we estimate who these cookbooks are aimed at? Often the preface or dedication will reveal who it's aimed at. Elizabeth Moxon in 1741 wrote in her book's preface, "A book necessary for mistresses of families, higher and lower women servants, and confined to things useful, substantial, and splendid, and calculated upon the measures of frugality." So she was obviously aiming at the lower middle class. If a cookbook does not use measurements, if it assumes a knowledge of basic procedures and an access to pre-made ingredients, like it says add your roux without telling you how to make a roux, then it was probably aimed at professional cooks who were working for the court or the upper gentry. These recipes often contain really expensive ingredients and very complex procedures. They assume you've got staff there, as well as the 14 rooms to actually work around each other. If the recipes contain or suggest measurements, explain procedures more thoroughly, or suggest cheaper alternatives, the cookbooks are thought to be aimed at the less professional cook. Someone perhaps who's cooking for a middle gentry family. If the cookbook really details its processes and suggests some really very different substitutions that are significantly less expensive, the cookbook may be marketed to the lower class or to the servants. For example, Hannah Glasse, one of the popular cookbook authors of the lower to mid gentry, suggested that a replacement for boiled down Glasse as a base for a sauce could actually be made from a mixture of marmalade, water, and thickener instead of boiled down meat broth. She claimed it would work just as well as a Glasse to flavor the meat. So by 1730, the changes were pretty well established throughout the upper classes. Printed books were just one mechanism to carry this idea through the culinary world, even to the colonies. Another way was by commonplace books, journals, manuscript cookbooks, letters, diaries, communicated and preserved recipes. One of the things I love about Sarah Taylor's book is you can see the lady's name beside the gingerbread recipe. That's who she got it from. So not only do these cookbooks tell us what these people were really interested in producing or what they might have eaten at a friend's house, it tells us the social network, who they were in contact with. So these books tell us more than just cooking, but the cooking itself is fascinating. Now, not everybody approved of the new cuisine. In 1731, it actually became part of a play written by Henry Fielding, and it inspired this particular picture by William Hogarth. It's called The Roast Beef of Old England. It's from 1731. The Grub Street Opera was the name of the play. Apparently English cooks had gotten roasting down so well that it was a hallmark of England. I actually have the song. This song is amazing. I've got the lyrics there. And what I'm going to play is a different version of this song. This is as it was written in 1731. The song I have recorded is from 1758. I found a recording from the 1870s of this song, and they simply added new events in the listing. So instead of ending, if the fleets did presume upon the main, they're talking about Admiral Nelson, they're talking about all kinds of things in the song. The idea of a roast beef being English apparently really stuck in the culture. So let's see if the technicals work here.
Roast beef was the Englishman's food. It ennobled our brains and enriched our blood. Our soldiers were brave and our courtiers were good. Oh, the roast beef of old England and old English roast beef.
England and France in the next verse.
But since we have learnt from old vapouring France to eat their ragouts as well as to dance, we're fed up with nothing but vain complaisance. Oh, the roast beef of old England and old English roast beef. Our fathers of old were robust, stout and strong, and kept open house with good cheer all day long, which made their lieutenants rejoice in this song. Oh, the roast beef of old England and old English roast beef. But now we are dwindled to what shall I name? A sneaking poor race half begotten and tame, who sullied the honours that once shone in fame. Oh, the roast beef of old England and old English English roast
The
beef.
next line is a throwback to Mara's discussion last week.
When good Queen Elizabeth sat on the throne, ere coffee or tea or some slip-slops were known, the world was in terror if there she did frown. All the roast beef of old England and old English roast beef.
So that gives you an idea of how the English thought of themselves. They thought as long as they had roast beef, they would be stout, strong, and able to defeat the world. So when that beef got threatened by this new way of cooking, some people didn't like it. Now the English cookbooks themselves railed against the French cooking. Hannah Glasse in 1676 said, quote, "But if gentlemen will have French cook, they must pay for French tricks." And one apocryphal story had a cook requesting 50 hands from his master to make one meal. 2 were to be put on the table. The other 48 were to be reduced to a vial of essence to enrich the sauces of the rest of the dishes. So along with this new cooking style, the dishes also offered diagrams, or the books also offered diagrams of how you're supposed to put dishes on the table. How are you supposed to serve this new stuff? This was part of the Foodways changes in the 1700s, and it once again was based on what happened in the 1600s. In 1664, Louis XIV gave a banquet, and he used 100 dozen individual porcelain dishes to hold individual pieces of out-of-season fruit inside of a sugar sculpture. Now, the sugar sculpture was described as magnificent. These were greenhouse-grown fruits, so they were just hugely unimaginable at the time. But the talk in the diaries and in the letters for those that attended that banquet centered around the cute little porcelain dishes. So, this is the start of a new way of looking at dishes. The cute small dishes began to catch on, so as the 1700s progressed, we see fewer recipes for a big 14-inch pie, and more recipes for 2-inch tarts or 1-inch little tartlets. The serving methods of the table changed, so not everyone was expected to be served from one main dish. They were intended to serve 3 to 4, maybe 5, from the dishes that they could reach on the side. This multiplied the number of dishes on the table, and the type of dishes changed also. The ceramic became the fashion. The dishes on the table did not have to be all matchy-matchy like Mara shared with us last week. Did not have to be of the same pattern even, but it needed to be ceramic to fit the new taste. The archaeological record here in Virginia mirrors that change. The consumer revolution that hit the Virginia colonies in the mid-1700s increased spending by the gentry on things such as teapots, tea equipment, different kinds of dishes, and different types of cookware. Archaeological remains, also known as trash pits, from that time start showing more ceramic pieces. All ceramics break, crack, or become unusable for their original purpose. Once they're broken, they may be relegated to use in the kitchen or ultimately passed to indentured or enslaved persons that they're on the property. Ultimately, they get tossed. That's when the archaeologist gets excited. They help us determine what kind of cooking and serving were done at that time period here in the colony. More of the ceramics started being produced, which brought down the price, which increased demand, which meant more bits were starting to show up in the trash pits. Because the food served had changed from the last decade, the dishes also had new shapes. The dishes had to fill new needs, like this terrine. The cooking in the early part of the 1700s, late 1600s, the types of soup were called pottages, and when they're cold, they're actually thick enough to slice. So you can't put a thin soup on a plate or a bordered platter. You needed a separate terrine for it. So this is why these kind of dishes became more and more popular. Thick stews and pottages could be served in shallow bowls, not the deeper soup bowls that became necessary. Smaller side dishes, often called made dishes, we'd probably equate them with casseroles today, also required smaller servingware because you were only planning on serving 3, 4, maybe 5 people from that one dish. So the multiplicity on the table plan really created a demand for dishes. And dishware did have a role in a status display. It showed off your social standing. Ben Franklin, in his autobiography, in his own words, or in my own words, describes how the new dishes invaded his house. Quote, "For instance, my breakfast was a long time bread and milk, no tea." He claimed no status from what he drank. "And I ate it out of a 2-penny earthen porringer with a pewter spoon. But mark how luxury will enter families and make a progress. In spite of principle, being called one morning to breakfast, I found it in a china bowl with a spoon of silver. They had been bought for me without my knowledge by my wife, and had cost her the enormous sum of 23 shillings, for which she had no other excuse or apology to make, but she thought that her husband deserved a silver spoon and china bowl as well as any of his neighbors." This was the first appearance of plate or china in our house, which afterward, in the course of years, as our wealth increases, augmented gradually to 700 pounds in value. So notice he blames his wife for this. But the status was there. Her husband deserved china just as much as any of the neighbors. Another big change at the table was the widespread use of the fork. It changed not only how you ate, but what you ate. Those casseroles and main dishes became more easily conveyable to your mouth. It also changed how you looked at your napkin. Napkins kind of went in and out of favor during the 1700s. I can't imagine what it was like when they weren't in favor. You probably used the tablecloth, but the necessity for napkins decreased when the use of forks increased. Now, with this change in how you cook or how you present things, there was also a change in how you cook. It changed the cooking hardware. The open hearth had been for generations the main cooking method, but the slow, low temperatures needed for braising meats and slow cooking things like the cullis were difficult to control on an open hearth. The immediate attention needed when making a sauce was very difficult to render on an open hearth. It was much better to put it on a different way of cooking, and braziers were used. They were like big bowls standing on legs, and you could put coals underneath and heat up that area. But they weren't real safe, and they weren't in the same place all the time. So slowly, the stew stove, or the stew hole, or it's also called the potager, which is very confusing because a potager can also be a garden, came into use. This is the recreation of one at Monticello. And if you look on the far right side, there's a built-in cauldron. You would fill that up with water in the morning and get it hot, and you had built-in hot water. These started being accepted more and more. I don't know why it took English cooks so long to accept these. These really save your back. So instead of being bent over or squatted down working on the hearth, you could just see straight into your pot, even as short as I am. And if you've got the distance right between your fire grates on the lower side and your stove holes on the top, those are actually holes down in the masonry, and you can set your pots down in there. If that distance is correct, that stove is a lot more fuel efficient than working on an open fire. So, now that you've got all this vast knowledge of these new ways of cooking, how do you figure out what to serve? Well, the cookbooks took care of that too, because they provided menus for appropriate dishes to serve at each of the 2 or 3 courses offered at a grand meal across different seasons. So they helped establish the rules for the performance of gentry eating. And this was really a big performance. It would have lasted several hours, and that was what was to be expected. This was the place where social interaction was encouraged, and a time when you got to display your status and fill your stomach at the same time. Not everyone ate like the cookbook suggested, because remember, it was a very, very class-based society. The performance of eating was different for every class and was affected a bit by geography too. Here in the colonies, we had some new foodstuffs that were unknown in England. We introduced pumpkin, corn in its various forms, like grits or hominy or soaked or cooked grain or as flour. And those things were easier to obtain here than than they had been in England. And some of the staples used in England obviously were a little harder to get here, particularly up in the northern colonies. Here in Virginia, we're blessed. When the English brought over their vegetables and their favorite trees and fruits, they took off in Virginia. Not so, of course, in the northern colonies. For example, the wheat of the time, which we now, interestingly enough, grow mostly in the northern tier states. At the time, their wheat could not withstand the cold. So wheat didn't grow well in the upper colonies. Here in Virginia, wild game formed a big part of the diet at various points in time. Apparently when the colonists first came here, they depended on domestic livestock. Then they got more into hunting, then they went back to domestic livestock. In England, that really wasn't a choice because the game were controlled by the landed gentry. Unless you were landed gentry, you didn't get to eat venison much. Very different here, obviously. The patterns found here from faunal analysis, now Dave's going to laugh at me about this, but if you want to understand what faunal analysis is, it's archaeologists picking through ancient kitchen trash. So that's what faunal analysis is. It's hugely expensive to do. But what they've unearthed is that the colonists first depended on livestock, and it formed anywhere between 14 and 15%, or wild game was what they depended on for one section of their eating from 1740 to 1790. It was around 14% of their food. This varied where you were in the gentry. It varied if you were enslaved. So the analysis from the root cellar associated with the time right after Augustine Washington's death at Ferry Farm. Mary Washington and her children, including at that point George Washington, were occupying Ferry Farm. And that analysis indicates that at that point, they were eating more wild game than was standard. Ferry Farm has postulated that that might have been because Mary was trying to economize. There are other explanations. Maybe that was comfort food for her in a very difficult time. The information gleaned from a storehouse archaeological site at Ferry Farm, it covers a slightly different time period of the Washington's occupation there, and it tells a little bit of a different story. It indicates that pork and beef were the major meats available to the Washingtons, and lowers to 17% of their diet, the meat made up of wild game, determined by the bones. The faunal assemblage that was analyzed at the Washington slave quarter tells of a diet that includes domestic animal, but has typically a higher percentage of wild meat. You would expect that. Provisioning strategies for the enslaved varied from owner to owner across different areas. So apparently the Washingtons did allow some hunting of game for the table. Now, faunal assemblages are a great source of information. We can take a look at some of the nuts, some of the grains, some of the whole seeds that were used in the kitchen, but there are inadequacies. Those bones don't come out of the ground with sauce clinging to them. We don't know exactly how they were cooked. We can see if they were burned, we can see if they were cooked, we can see if they are long, like for a roast, or short, like for a casserole or a stew, or a made dish. Sometimes we can see butcher marks or knife marks or gnawing, or if the bone was broken, either before or after cooking, but we can't tell the flavor of the sauce. So what were some of the flavors that were popular in the 1700s? I call it kind of the taste of the empire. Curry was huge. Now obviously England was the colonial overlord for India, where curry is famous. This actually makes a pretty good curry recipe. Other imported spices were cinnamon, allspice, nutmeg, just like in the medieval times, used in different amounts though. Different kind of salts were called out in different recipes, depending on what you're doing with them. You know, we now have pink Himalayan salt, we have yellow salt, we have white salt, we have sea salt, we have evaporated salt. They had that too. Cheese, for example, called for a flaked salt, which would have been an evaporated salt, and it comes out as very large flakes. And the reason you wanted that for your cheese is it melted into the curd evenly, so your cheese wouldn't have like pockets of salt in it. Pink salt, although not from the Himalayas like we claim today, was used, as well as black salt. I hate to think what was in the black salt. Sometimes the recipe specified from a specific area to get the salt from there, and that's probably because the minerals in the salt added to the flavor of the dish, or how the salt behaved, particularly in cheese and butter. There was no use of vanilla extract that I can find, which is interesting because they knew about the vanilla bean. They knew how to make vanilla sugar, which is when you embed the beans in sugar until the sugar tastes like vanilla. But I'm not finding any recipes for making vanilla extract or for recipes that use vanilla extract. Now, in the place of vanilla extract, they used rose water, they used orange blossom water, and they used things like lavender. Lavender is a big flavoring again now. There's actually a cookbook out that specifies only lavender recipes. So you can get lavender chicken, you can get lavender biscuits, you can get lavender bread, very much like what would have been known in the 1700s. Violet sugar was another taste that they used. Violets do not survive the distillation process, the flavoring, or the cooking process. So you'd bury the violets in the sugar, and you would get this faintly purple, violet flavored and violet smelling sugar. Now, should you decide that you want to take on making violet sugar, only use dark purple violets. The dogtooth violets are actually poisonous, and the white violets don't have the same flavoring composition as the dark purple ones, so please only use the dark purple ones. I don't want anyone dying from my presentation. Now, during the 1700s, as the years rolled on, the price of spices went down. By 1771, a Scottish chain of stores had set up stores here in Falmouth and in Fredericksburg, and they provisioned traveling salespeople. These folks sold spices in small amounts, so people who might not have been able to pay to import large quantities of spices suddenly had access to the empire. Some of the dishes recorded in the cookbooks from the 1700s are the same dishes we cook today. They just go by different names. For example, in the 1700 cookbook, you'll find a recipe for Scotch collops. That's Salisbury steak. Mincemeat, the kind with real meat in it, and you can still buy on the grocery store shelves. My children have informed me they don't want me to fix it anymore, so. Bread pudding, green pea soup, these are all things that we still eat today, that the recipes are very similar for. The flavor that was the most sought after in the 1700s was a very sharp flavor. So piquant flavors, and generally more sour than we choose today. As Americans, we eat a whole lot of sugar. And in the cooking of the time, they chose the sour over the sweet. One favorite flavor was called verjuice, and it's a distilled essence of unripe grapes. We really don't have a comparable for that particular flavor. Lemons and limes were popular if you could afford them. Greens like sorrel, endive, and tansy were used in salads, cooked dishes, flavorings, and garnishes. Now, a word about tansy. Tansy actually means two things. One, it means the herb. Second, it means a dish. The herb itself, the FDA has found, contains an alkaloid that will kill your liver. So they no longer recommend that you use tansy as a flavoring or you consume it in any way. And the way they would have used it in the 1700s as a flavoring is you make a 21 egg cake, which would be anywhere 3 to 7 layers. You take one sprig of tansy and you trace it through the batter. You throw the tansy away and you cook the batter. So that cake would taste like tansy from just that minimal introduction of the tansy. Now, tansy itself tastes like overripe endive wrapped around fennel stalks. So to me, it's not very good, but it was a favorite sought-after flavor of the time. It is also a reference to a dish, kind of like, well, we call them today cottage puddings. Mississippi mud cake is one example, where you have a cake-like layer at the bottom, and then you have a fairly solid custardy layer on top. The lava cakes that are popular now are too thin on top to be in that same category, but the idea of the tansy as a dish persisted well into the 1800s, even though by 1800 they'd kind of set aside eating tansy. Now, garnishes and presenting the food were just as important as how you cooked it. You didn't send a meat up to the table without any sauce. It had to have sauce. And you're not going to leave some poor roasted piece of beef or chicken or duck or whatever it was on the platter just swimming in its sauce all alone. You would put vegetables, cooked vegetables around as garnish, or you put force meatballs, and I'm saying force with an F, not horse meat. It's not something that's going to pull a carriage. Force meat is, we would call it now sausage stuffing. It's sausage or processed meat mixed in with bread, formed into little balls and either baked or fried. And you put those around the meat after you put the sauce on and serve it up that way to kind of garnish it. Sweet dishes tended to be really, really sweet. Molasses, sugar, honey were all widely used. This dependence on sugar, as well as on rum and tea, came under fire in the 1764 Sugar Act by Parliament, which extended the 1733 Molasses Act. And these acts were designed to give the British producers who produced more expensive sugars and molasses the edge in the market. The Quartering Act, which required that those of us in the colony would actually put up and provide for British soldiers. The Stamp Act and the Townshend duties in 1767 kind of changed the world of food here. The colonies had enjoyed a good trade in foodstuffs, not only with England, but also with each other, and the new taxation helped to cut that down. For example, in Virginia, we were sending flour to the upper colonies, where they couldn't raise the wheat as well. Any kind of imported or moved product was taxed. So we're all familiar with the dreaded tax on tea, but the internal trade restrictions kind of added to the boiling point. Now the colonists responded to those boycotts, or responded to that with boycotts. So they said, okay, we're only going to buy stuff that doesn't come from England. Yeah, well. This teapot is held at the American History Museum. It looks like a wonderful, no Stamp Act, we're pro-American, we're going to buy this, except that it was manufactured in England. So, clever marketing. You had to be on your toes when you went marketing. So after the Revolutionary War, as a nation, we began to wonder, well, what does it mean to be a nation? How are we going to build our own culture? Foodways went along with that. The emphasis on American foodstuffs persisted, but again, there was plenty of evidence of importation of food. The British foodways were still predominating, particularly in this area. This area in the Northern Neck especially, remained very, very English. Guests recorded menus at Mount Vernon that majored on meat, as well as stuff produced there on the plantation. But Foodways ideas were beginning to change, just as they did at the end of the 1600s. In 1797, Amelia Simmons published a little bitty book, 47 pages long. She entitled it American Cookery. This book set forth the idea of, quote, simple abundance, and that became seen as the hallmark of the American style of cuisine leading into the 1800s. She had recipes for iconic dishes, what we consider iconic, like custard pie, custard pumpkin pie, Johnny cake, hoe cake. There's also the aspirational level recipes, the 21 egg grand cake. Word usage in the book reflected the new Americanized references. So instead of biscuit, we had cookie. This book, this little bitty book, 47 pages, was named by the Library of Congress as one of the 88 most influential American books of all times. It was produced by roughly the same group of publishers and thinkers that produced Noah Webster's Blueback Speller, so it was an attempt to codify American cuisine. And her ideas of simple and abundant formed the foodways that led into the 1800s. So food can be a fad that changes over time. Food can be aspirational, so who we are, really who we want to be. And food can also be medicine, and that's one thing these cookbooks put out. There was, starting with Galen, the idea of the four humors: hot, cold, warm, moist, or dry, or moist, dry. So, when you were sick, you would be prescribed different foods to eat based on those. Those ideas were included in some of these cookbooks, and they undergirded some of the ways that foods were served. For example, if you were known to lose your temper and were in the process of losing your hair, you were considered to be hot and dry. So you'd be prescribed cold and moist foods, cheese and beer. Okay, that's not a bad prescription, right? If you developed a runny nose, you needed to be hot and dry. So you'd be prescribed roast beef, you'd be prescribed red wine, and bread. Yeah, not such a bad prescription. Okay, these ideas date back to the Greeks. They predate the bacterial cause of disease idea. And they're not dead yet. About 8 months ago, the Freelance Star put out an article in their food section that talked about eating for wellness based on the 4 humors. So sometimes foodways go back to what they were before. Now, talking about the disease idea of foodways. If you choose to go look up some of these books and actually do some of this cooking, which I encourage, it's fun, please be careful. There are plenty of places you can get copies of these older books. You can get them from iBiblio, you can get them from Project Gutenberg, you can get them from Google Play. Different libraries have facsimile editions. There are also manuscripts online. But their foodways did not include the germ theory. They did not know about what we consider food safety. So the recipe that I found to take a leg of fresh pork, approximately 15 pounds of fresh pork, soak it in a brine, not sweet enough to keep it fresh, nor salty enough to keep it fresh for 3 days, then boil it and serve it, is a recipe for a stomachache. Put on your food safety hat when you're looking at these recipes. Some of them are great, some of them are but it's an interesting way to attack history. There's also another consideration. If you want to use some of the flavorings, like violet water or rose water, please don't use tansy, or some of the others, make sure that the distillates you're using are designed to be edible, particularly of the flower essences. They're produced as essential oils, they're produced for potpourri, they're produced for aromatherapy, and those are not edible. You have to make sure that what you buy is edible. I don't want to poison anybody. So, with that being said, go forth and eat well. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
That one slide that you showed, kitchen, did you say that was Thomas Jefferson's kitchen in Monticello?
Yes, that is a recreated stew stove in the kitchen at Monticello.
The rose water, did you make it out of rose hips, rose petals, or what was the process, or what was the various process?
You gathered the rose petals early in the morning, and then you used your albenic or your small-scale distiller to actually bring the rose oil out of the petals. And then you would collect it, and that's how you would get the rose water. It's still used extensively in North Africa and the Mediterranean cooking, so you can pick it up at some of the major grocery stores as well as the Mediterranean grocery stores. And it smells heavenly.
Were recipes ever circulated in newspapers?
Later on, yes. Primarily, they seem to have been circulated by word of mouth and by letters, and then they eventually tumbled into the books.
I've seen that cookbooks were expensive.
It depended on who they were marketing to, and it depended on the size too. The little small portfolios, they could be fairly inexpensive, and many of them were serialized. So if you were a servant and you were cooking for a mistress, you could go out and buy just one little piece. And then 2 weeks later or a month later, you could go buy the next piece and the next piece until you finally had the full collection.
How much did this one cost?
I'm not sure what the cost on this one was. This is actually held at Library of Congress.
They put recipes in the newspapers of the time, just as a little side interest.
I've seen recipes from the 1800s. I haven't seen any recipes from the 1700s included in newspapers. That might be an artifact of my own research, but I haven't seen any.
So do they cook differently for kids?
No. The kids got the beer, the kids got the wine, the kids got the regular food. If you lost your teeth, good luck to you. And losing your teeth was a very common thing. There was no dental hygiene at the level we know it. Even George suffered from that, which may explain why he loved fish so much, because you can gum it to death. Any other questions? Yes.
Last week we had the discussion on drinking. Do you have any idea of what the enslaved people drank? We had to talk, there was lots of artifacts to give you ideas of what the gentry were drinking.
Right.
But do you have, they're not sort of artifacts for the enslaved people. Do you happen to have any thoughts on what they drank?
Alcohol was probably not part of their ration.
Yeah.
That was too dangerous of a combination. So it probably would have been either some sort of herb tea that they brewed for themselves or water. Herb teas were quite popular. There's one, lemon balm tea. Once the blockade went into effect, it became the ladies' favorite afternoon tea. And lemon balm tea we now know is a sedative. So if your kids are being really rowdy one afternoon, make them some lemon balm tea. It smells like furniture polish, lemon pledge. It's great stuff. But yeah, it does have that side effect. Yes?
Would you please go back to the picture of Monticello and
Yes.
explain that kitchen again? I don't think I got it all.
There we go. So you can see where that tea kettle is sitting in between those two dark spots. Those are holes down into the stew stove. And if you size your pots right, they can sit down in that hole to get closer to the fire holes underneath. So you'd only put fire in however many burners you were using in effect. And the far right, big round dark hole, that's the pot, the cauldron, that you would fill up with water and get the water boiling so you'd have hot water all day. Boy, that must have been a luxury. You know, just open the lid and there you go with the hot water.
Okay, thank you.
So there'd be fire under each of those little,
If you were using it. And it would just slowly, depending on how brisk your fire was, but it would just slowly take care of cooking the pot set over top. Mhm.
Pairings. Was there what was the earliest instance of pairings like food and the drink?
Some of the cookbooks from the 1600s, like La Varenne, suggested which type of wine he had served with his food. Because it was a catalog of what had been successful, that's what people copied.
So this was continued up to the 1718s? Okay.
Yeah. What's old is new again. Mhm.
When were forks first used?
Try again?
When were forks first used?
forks.
Forks, as opposed to hands.
They came over into Spain, actually, with one of the queens. And they caught on slowly through the 1600s, into the 1700s, until by the early 1700s, hosts were expected to provide them. Before that, you were better off bringing your own. Mhm.
Weren't the early forks just have two prongs or something?
Yes. Yes. So that was a whole new skill you had to master, was not only getting things on there, but getting it to your mouth without dumping it down your shirt. And mostly tonight I centered on some French and English cooking styles. Obviously, every country had their own style. That's why the roast beef of Old England resonated so much with the English, and why we worked so hard as a nation to set up our own foodways. So the use of forks and what they looked like really developed in each culture differently, and the timing was different as well. Any other questions? So great. Thank you.